as calls for a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Sudan grow. The African Union's Peace and Security Council met over the weekend and came up with a number of plans to intervene in the nation and bring the hostilities to an end. Liesl Vaudran joins us now. She's with the International Crisis Group, a senior advisor there for more on the plan of the African Union. Liesl, thank you very much for your time. A lot has been said about where's the African Union, and here we have the Peace and Security Council meeting on the weekend. Perhaps initial reaction?
Yes, it was very good that the Peace and Security Council met at the level of heads of state. It was convened by the Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni. Uganda is chairing the Peace and Security Council, which has 15 members of the 55 members of the African Union. South Africa is a member of the Peace and Security Council at the moment. And because it's rotating, some members are there for 2 years and others for 3 years. So it was a very important meeting. It's the third time that the Peace and Security Council has met in these 6 weeks since the 15th of April, when the crisis really started. And I must say it is hugely complicated for the African Union to get a response to this crisis, and these ceasefires that have been announced just don't seem to stick, and hundreds and hundreds of lives are being lost. People are fleeing their homes still outside of Khartoum, also in Darfur, especially in the west of the country. There's huge ongoing violence in Sudan.
What makes it difficult for the African Union to intervene?
It is extremely difficult because the bottom line is actually the African Union doesn't have leverage over these generals. Two generals, the General al-Burhan and his deputy, his former deputy, Hemedti, he's called, from the RSF forces, who are basically fighting it out. The RSF in the streets of Khartoum and the army, basically the Air Force from the air bombing, the RSF positions, and a lot of civilian casualties in the end. So who can stop them? They've been talks in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, also convened by the Americans. So obviously powerful states who have leverage on actors like this. The incentive is there, the pressure is there. Also because, there are sanctions against these individuals. They have a lot of their funds, their money in the US or in Saudi Arabia. If you look on a map, actually Sudan, Saudi Arabia is not that far away. So the African Union finds itself in a position where, as we felt actually in Libya in 2011 and it's still going on, sort of sidelined and struggling to come up with solutions that will last. Hopefully this meeting and the initiatives that have now been decided upon, will help at least to get a process where there's a ceasefire and then some mediation, some talks starting.
Oh my, so according to what you've explained, this criticism that has been directed towards the African Union, we have not been condemning reasonably. And so when you speak of the AU not having leverage, but the Saudis do, the United Nations does, the Americans do because of the sanctions, because monies that are in those countries, and this being an incentive on their part and them having a leverage, how should we understand the relationship, or how far do the relationships go with these particular countries?
Yes, good relationships. I mean, the Sudan, is a huge, important, influential country. So the United Nations actually have been involved. The US also. The US has lost some of its leverage in the Horn of Africa, generally in that part of the world, but it's still an important player. And then generally Saudi Arabia, but the League of Arab States as well. Egypt is an important country neighboring Sudan. There are now many refugees that have fled Sudan, So all these countries play a role, and really what we at the International Crisis Group and others have been saying is that there should be a united international response, because for now we don't really see that, different countries sometimes in wars like this side with different groups or rebels or the state. But for now, everybody wants to seem to have a solution, but they all have their own solution. So rather get behind the African Union. It is the continental body. It has got instruments. The African Union could fairly easily, it would take a couple of weeks or even months to get an intervention force if there's a ceasefire, to ensure that the ceasefire is being upheld. We have forces, African Union forces all over the place, in neighboring Somalia for one. So the ideal would be for the African Union to be given that opportunity to lead this initiative. But even within the African Union, unfortunately, there's also neighboring heads of state from IGAD, which is the regional economic community, like SADC, that actually is responsible for peace and security in their region, that also now has got a mechanism for intervention. But the urgent thing is, whoever it is and whichever mechanism or important actors that are intervening, is that the fighting stops. There must be, humanitarian aid must reach all the victims in Khartoum and elsewhere, and that the refugees are also assisted. They are all, in Chad, in South Sudan, and in Egypt as well.
Yeah. Speaking of the refugees, you speak of the African Union. They need a chance to at least lead the process. It begs the question, who's stopping them? And the second part on the refugees, is there a role that they can play there, at least for now? You've got people who were fortunate enough to get onto a flight and go back home, but you've got people who call that country home and now they've been displaced. Is there any immediate role that the African Union can play for now, at least?
Yes, it is actually, it was decided at this meeting on Saturday to dispatch envoys to all the neighboring countries to engage with those envoys to assist refugees, because what often happens is people flee their homes. Sometimes they don't have their documents with them, their passports, and some of them are literally blocked, at the border because they don't have the necessary papers. They must also ensure that humanitarian actors like the UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees and others, be allowed access and be allowed to assist these hundreds of thousands of refugees. Then, as you say, the South Africans were evacuated. Many other countries, United States, France, everybody else has evacuated their citizens. The embassies are empty. But what about the Sudanese themselves or other people who, have families and can't leave? So the African Union is doing its best, but it can do more. It should do more. It should have that sense of urgency instead of this internal bickering of, okay, who's doing what and who's leading this initiative? Is it the chairperson, Mustafa Mohamed? Is it the chair of the African Union for 2023, who is the president of the Comores? I think time is of the absolute essence now.
Liesl, so this 6-point plan, what does then it mean in light of everything that you have highlighted, in particular where incentives are concerned, where leverage and the AU not having any is concerned? There's a lot is said about African solutions to African problems, but if we have polarized interests on the continent, how then should the everyday person on this continent read that situation and the overall role of the African Union?
Yes, I started, you're right, I started by saying that leverage is an issue, but those countries with leverage should also realize that for a lasting solution, they should get behind African solutions, whether it's the African Union or neighbors or, as I said, the regional organization like IGAD. The thing is, we saw that with the crisis in Ethiopia. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. What happened was, in practice, other actors, including the United States, were behind the scenes, also giving capacity, money, etc. But it allowed the African Union to own the process. We had the Pretoria Agreement. Today we see fairly good progress being made. Okay, very complicated. We can talk about another day on the Ethiopia crisis, but still. But just in terms of mechanisms, and as you say, people have been very skeptical of the African Union, and rightly so. But the African Union does have the capacity, it does have instruments in place, it must coordinate. And then the other actors, some of them are willing, and, it's also about some not wanting to step back and let the African Union lead initiatives. I think it is, we often overlook the places, South Sudan for one, where the African Union is present. Peace deals have been organized, neighboring Chad, Somalia, as I've mentioned. There are peace missions and efforts, and in the Eastern DRC. So this crisis in Sudan is definitely a very important test for the African Union and for the international community at large, to see how this is going to be handled. And it's not just a slogan, and it's not just because we love the African Union or African solutions that we're saying it. What I'm saying is, as we saw in Ethiopia, that is really sustainable, because Libya, 10 years down the line, we still don't have a solution, because the actors are maybe not credible or don't have an interest in long-term stability.
And that's just it. Is it imaginable, or is it impossible, reimagining, for lack of a better phrase, the African Union itself? I heard you mention there a little while ago that you, especially maybe on this continent where polarized interests are concerned with various countries on the continent, we've got 55 countries, not all of them are signatory to the AU, but is it time to shave it down? So much consultation and yet nothing, perceived that nothing gets done.
Yes, unfortunately now we do have all 55 member states, signatories or ratified the African Union Constitutive Act. There are other instruments of the AU like the Continental Free Trade Area, which I think we've talked about in the past, where not everybody is signed on. But with Morocco joining the AU in 2017, everybody's now on board. There is a big rethink of organs of the African Union instruments. Last year the African Union celebrated 20 years of its existence. Now on the in 25th of May, we had the 60th anniversary of the OAU. The OAU was founded in 1963. So there is a constant rethinking, and what I think one positive is, at least for now, civil society organizations on the continent are being more and more vocal about what changes they would like to see. And one of them is definitely listening to civil society organizations, the youth, not only being a club of elites and heads of state who get together once a year, make decisions, and then when crises come, they're dithering and divided amongst themselves. So there's a big rethink, and I think one of the rethinks is definitely this issue of, we have the African Union in Addis Ababa, but then we have all these regional organizations like SADC, ECOWAS, so on. It's important because it's a big continent, so you need regional structures, but then there needs to be a stronger mechanism, and there's going to be a meeting in July about the relationship between the AU and the regional economic communities. So that's one of the things that is maybe a fault in our architecture, which we need to fix, so that when, as I say, when crisis breaks out, it doesn't take 6 weeks and more to actually figure out who is now the first responder and who should be in the front line coordinating these efforts.
Thank you very much to Liesl Vaudran. She's with the International Crisis Group.